Thank you for joining the RTC Executive Advisory Committee meeting. Chair Anderson, staff is ready for you to begin the meeting.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Travis Anderson for the record. I'd like to call to order the July 30th, 2020 meeting of the Executive Advisory Committee. RTC staff will begin with a roll call of committee members, introduce staff on the line, and also touch on a few housekeeping items.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. David Gloria, Management Analyst for the RTC for the record. I'll be calling your name in alphabetical order. Please confirm your attendance as I read your name. Chair Travis Anderson.
Here.
Mario Bermudez.
Here.
Dennis Cedarberg.
Here.
Dale Daffern.
I'm here, David.
Keegan Luttrell.
Here.
Michael Mays.
Here.
Ed McGuire.
Here.
Joanna Murphy.
Here.
Joey Paskey.
Here.
Vice Chair Sandra Rosenberg.
Here.
Richard Sechrist.
Here.
Robert Summerfield.
Here.
And Michael Tossi.
Here.
Thank you. Please note we have several RTC staff on the line for today's meeting. This includes Mr. David Swallow, Deputy CEO, Mr. Francis Julian, Deputy CEO, Mr. John Penuelis, Senior Director of Engineering, Mr. Craig Rayburn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, Mr. David Clyde, Associate General Counsel, Mr. Joe Jamiani, Manager of Engineering, Mr. Andrew Kelman, Manager of Transportation Planning, Ms. Deb Reardon, Principal Transportation Planner, and finally, Ms. Eileen Pastor, Government Affairs Supervisor, will be reading public comments. As the chair mentioned, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. When Chair Anderson calls for comments from the committee or calls for a vote, please remember to unmute yourself before speaking. Remember to state your name for the record before providing comment. Be sure to mute your line if you are not speaking. Voting will be done verbally. The chair will call for ayes and nays. If there are no nays, then the motion will carry. If there are nays, then a roll call vote will be required. In the event of a roll call vote, please wait for your name to be read to provide your vote. The chair will call for any comments or questions after an item has been presented. Thank you, Chair Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Gloria. Mr. Penuelis, for the first item, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Your first item is to conduct the first citizens participation period. But before we do that, we need to mention that on March 22nd, 2020, the state of Nevada Executive Department issued Declaration of Emergency Directive 006, which suspended the requirement to have a physical location for public meetings pursuant to Directive 006. And for the health and safety of the community, this meeting is being held telephonically. To allow for public participation, the RTC is accepting public comments via email at publiccomments@rtc.com. Comments can be submitted to be read aloud or to be added directly to the written record. Ms. Eileen Pastor will read the public comments received by the RTC.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, for the record. This is the first time set aside for public comment. This time is limited to comments on items included on the agenda. Comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Eileen Pastor, RTC Government Affairs Supervisor for the record. There are no public comments to a posted agenda item.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, Mr. Penuelis.
Yes, thank you, Chair Anderson. John Penuelis again for the record. Item 2 is to approve your agenda. Staff would like to make a modification to that agenda. We need to pull items 4 and 28. That was due to a clerical error in the minutes, which will require us to bring that back to you. Also, 28, that is an issue with the final reports and the reconciliation between our financial systems. That's a closeout. So both of those will be brought back to you at the next meeting. So with that, I would ask that the committee approve the agenda as modified.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? Not hearing any questions, I'd seek a motion.
Motion to approve the agenda?
We have a motion to approve the agenda. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. This motion carries.
And just for clarification, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that the motion was to accept the agenda as modified with items 4 and 28 pulled off of it.
My apologies, Mr. Chairman. Yes, that was my motion to accept the agenda as modified by staff.
Thank you.
Do we need to vote again?
Not in my estimation.
I'm good. This is David Gloria.
Okay. The motion carries. This would take us to item number 3, Mr. Penuelos.
Yes. Item 3 is to designate officers for the 2020 and 2021 session. The RTC policies and procedures provide that the chair and vice chair of the Executive Advisory Committee be rotated alphabetically by entity and designated annually every July. Staff would recommend that the new chair would be the member from the Nevada Department of Transportation, and the new vice chair would be the member from Clark County.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? If not, I would make a motion that we approve the new designation of the office chairman and vice chair, as Sandra chairman and Clark County as vice. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Hearing that, the motion carries.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I guess, Madam Chair, if I may, I'd like to recognize Travis for his stellar performance during these very difficult times. We've gone to an unprecedented format for these meetings, and Travis has rolled with the punches, has been available for our practice sessions, and has done a stellar job. So thank you very much for your service to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Penuelos. Chair Sandra Rosenberg, for the record, I would echo those comments. Thank you, Travis, for your service, and I hope I can do as well as you've managed over the past year. So moving on to the next item, Mr. Penuelos.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. John Penuelos again for the record. The next item is to approve the consent agenda. This consists of items 4 through 30 with the removal of items 4 and 28, and this can be taken in one motion.
Are there any comments or questions from the committee?
Madam Chair, this is Robert Summerfield, City of Las Vegas. I just have one comment on item 7 related to the map. I just, for the record, wanted to make sure that we're clear that that map represents a conceptual alignment for the BRT route and is not, in fact, the actual roads that the line would follow. It looks like the line following Bonneville on a one-way street. And so we just want to make sure that that's clear on the record, that that exhibit is just conceptualizing the route, but not the actual alignment.
Maybe Mr. Swallow would be the best person to address that comment.
Sure. Yeah, that's a fair point. And that's something we're looking at. And as we go through the preliminary engineering, we're going to look at that intersection again. But either we use the current connection off of Clark, or we the current connection off of Clark would probably be ideal. But that's something we'll look at. It's noted. Not meant to be prescripted. In fact, we're looking to award our preliminary engineering contract in September, so we'll get started on it.
Thank you, Mr. Swallow.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just thanking you for that clarification. We just want to make sure that was on the record. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for that clarification. Are there any additional questions or comments? If there are no more questions or comments, we have a motion on the floor.
Hi, this is Johanna from North Las Vegas. I move to approve the consent agenda as amended and with the notation from the City of Las Vegas.
Thank you for the motion. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. Thank you. Next item, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, for the record. Item 31 is to receive a presentation and approve the Southern Nevada Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Transportation Plan and will be introduced by Ms. Deb Reardon.
Thanks so much, Craig. This is Deb Reardon for the record. And so since the draft plan was presented to the committee in May, today, as you all consider approval, I'll provide just a quick recap, share some highlights of the public comments that were received, and next steps. So as a reminder, the plan focuses on improving mobility for people with disabilities, seniors, and low-income individuals whose transportation needs have really continued to increase since the last plan was updated in 2015. So the plan also serves as a forum for coordination among transportation and human service providers who were engaged throughout the plan's development through various outreach efforts. So related to outreach, the plan was developed with input by over 400 representatives from key organizations that represent urban and rural public transit, nonprofits, private transportation companies, and also government agencies. Outreach included 5 stakeholder committee meetings. We did 24 interviews, 3 roundtable events. We went to 5 existing partner meetings, an online inventory survey of over 100 providers, and also presentations at 8 RTC committee meetings. So this outreach occurred throughout the whole plan process, which included an evaluation of existing conditions and needs. The plan also included the inventory of existing providers and a gap analysis. So the document identifies 5 overarching goals and over 30 strategies to achieve these goals, along with a framework for ongoing coordination and implementation. So the draft plan was, actually, David, can you skip this slide? I don't know how that got in there. Okay, perfect, thank you. So the draft plan was available in May, and today I'll share 5 themes that we heard through public and stakeholder comments. So first, partners shared a need to identify impacts of the pandemic on providing transportation, things like social distancing, impacts on shared rides, declining revenue, and the need to coordinate sanitation and other protocols across providers. Second, we heard that transportation needs for low-income youth are continuing to grow. And so the plan has been updated to reflect transportation barriers to reach schools and also the need for equitable transportation options to charter schools. We also added in actions to provide more transit information and do bus pass signups for youth actually at the school sites. So third, the lack of accessible Uber and Lyft vehicles was also identified as a barrier. This has also been added to the plan, and outreach and problem solving with Uber is also underway. So we also heard that accessible paths of travel are an issue in rural areas in addition to near transit. So the related strategy has been updated to reflect this need. And lastly, there's ongoing interest to serve people outside of the paratransit boundary. And this is addressed through strategies such as exploring more on-demand services. So our next steps, RTC committees are reviewing the plan this month, followed by the RTC board in August. And the stakeholder committee will also continue to meet quarterly to facilitate implementation. And our first meeting is also scheduled in August. So this concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Deb. That was very informative. It's nice to continue to get updates on this. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? Okay, and just one more time, fantastic work on this. And thank you for the update. If there are no more
Thanks.
questions or comments, do we have a motion to approve the coordinated plan?
This is Michael Patsy, City of Henderson. So moved.
Thank you. We have a motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Okay, the motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the RTC, again for the record. Item 32 is to approve the onboard regional mobility plan. So today I'm going to review the onboard plan, which we have completed with substantial input and assistance from our partner agencies represented on this committee, as well as many other stakeholders. And I do want to just note up front that staff is seeking a recommendation for approval of the plan, including the 8 strategies and the 64 implementing projects. So first, I want to review the outreach and engagement activities we've conducted during the development of the plan. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. The outreach and public engagement efforts we've conducted for onboard are really the most extensive ever undertaken by the RTC. Over the past nearly 3 years, we've had a presence at more than 300 events. We've given more than 110 speaking engagements. We've had nearly 90,000 in-person contacts. And across the 3 onboard surveys we conducted, we've had more than 30,000 responses. We've also had 18 technical advisory group meetings with local agency planners, public works departments, and other partners. Many of you, if not most of you, have participated in most of those TAG meetings. We also held 4 community stakeholder meetings at key points in the plan development process. So as I prepare to quickly review the 8 onboard strategies, this is probably the right time, to acknowledge the realities of the moment we're in right now. Onboard is an aspirational plan that is intended to lay out a long-term vision for what mobility and transit in Southern Nevada should look like in 20 or more years. And at the same time we're moving this plan forward, we as a region are also facing an unprecedented transit and funding crisis as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession it's triggered. So while we are proposing this visionary plan that would obviously take significant resources to implement, the RTC is simultaneously proposing transit service changes that would result in a contraction of services. And you'll actually have a presentation on that a little later in this meeting. But as the region's metropolitan planning organization, it's very important that we continue to lay out that long-range vision so that as recovery eventually happens, we've already identified what we want to do with the resources that we will have available throughout that recovery. But I do, again, just want to emphasize that we understand how difficult this time is, and that onboard will eventually help play a role in the region's recovery. So with that, we'll just move into a quick review of the onboard strategies. The onboard recommendations consist of 8 strategies called Big Moves and 64 specific projects or programs to implement those strategies. Other than some minor wordsmithing, these 8 strategies and the 64 specific projects are unchanged since last August. And because I presented them to you multiple times, I'm only going to very briefly cover each one. But if you do have questions, we can answer them at the end of my presentation. So the first strategy is to build a high-capacity transit system. It's broken into 2 phases, 19 routes totaling just over 200 miles of high-capacity transit. And you can kind of see the phasing as it's proposed here. Next slide. Sorry, the second strategy is to expand transit service to maximize access to jobs and housing. In this slide, the map is basically showing, well, the blue area is showing where the RTC currently operates high frequency service. And the goal in that area would be to increase service, reduce headways, and try to make service improvements to increase just the quality of the transit service and the reliability. In the darker gray area, that's where the RTC currently operates some form of traditional transit, bus transit. The goal in those areas would be to increase the amount of that is higher frequency, essentially trying to even get to the point where we're off the timetable and people can just go to a bus stop and know that the next bus will be there within a few minutes. And then the lighter gray area is the rest of the urbanized part of the valley. And the goal in that area is to provide some form of public mobility or public transit alternatives. And it could be an eventual extension of bus service, but it could also be newer modes or alternatives such as rideshare partnerships, micromobility operations, things like that. Next slide. Third strategy is make all travel options safer and more secure. I think this is fairly self-explanatory, but the one thing, most of this is relating to transit and walkability to and from transit. But I do want to just draw attention to the first bullet point, the Traffic Crash Review and Countermeasures Program, which would be an annual report that the RTC would put out that summarizes probably a historical trend of traffic crashes and identifies hotspots and countermeasure recommendations using the latest guidance and in consultation with the local agencies. Next slide. Fourth strategy is to make short trips easier. So this one started out as improving first mile, last mile connections to transit, but as the plan itself took on a broader mobility focus, this strategy also underwent a broader change. And so what you can see here are things that are intended to improve that first mile, last mile connection, but just in general, make shorter trips easier and a better, safer option for pedestrians, bicyclists, as micromobility becomes more utilized to make sure that's a viable option as well. Next slide, please. So the fifth strategy is to expand service for older adults, veterans, and people with disabilities. And so if you think back actually to the previous plan that we presented, that plan actually covers much of the same material here. And so the implementation, there is a really good synergy between those. But this plan, this basically identifies a lot of those features that were addressed through the Human Services Coordinated Transit Plan. Next slide. So the sixth strategy is then improving connections to major destinations. So focusing on getting access to and from and within the airport, but also on ensuring that transit is a really strong and viable option for major event destinations, such as the new stadium, T-Mobile Arena, destinations like that. Next slide. Seventh strategy is providing reliable transit for resort corridor employees. So this focuses on really two things. First, developing better ways to, or better, more reliable ways to allow resort corridor employees to get to the general area where they work. And then the second area that it kind of focuses on is improving transit circulation within and around the resort corridor. So the idea of shuttles that serve back of house entrances, which are preferred for many resort corridor employees, and making sure that services like that are developed and implemented eventually. And then the next slide, next one, thank you. The next strategy then is to leverage new technology to improve mobility. And so this also includes some that are transit related, but it also includes implementation of what here we've called the FAST OS, but that's the Fast Technology Roadmap, a project or process that many of the members of this committee were involved in a few years ago that outlined how new technologies would be implemented and utilized with FAST. This also includes the idea of increasing the infrastructure for electric vehicles, both transit vehicles, but also personal vehicles, the eventual development, hopefully, of a network of solar charging system within the valley. So next slide. Like I said, I'll just mention there'll be an opportunity if anyone has questions on any of those strategies at the end of the presentation to bring those up. So we thought it was important to understand the economic impacts and benefits that would come from the eventual implementation of ONBOARD. Next slide. So we looked at 4 basic types of economic impacts related to transit and mobility improvements. So first, the spending impacts or multipliers from the actual expenditures of funds. That's something that we're all familiar with through the fuel revenue indexing tracking. Next are the societal benefits and the economic impacts. So these are the types of benefits that result from, for example, the ability for customers to reach businesses when they otherwise wouldn't probably go to those businesses, or the ability of workers to be able to reliably reach their jobs. And then finally are the land value and economic development impacts. So these mostly relate to the increases in land value that typically occur after investments in fixed route transit infrastructure and operations. The economic impact analysis basically boils down to the impacts that would come from the high capacity transit system that's recommended in the plan and the impacts that would come from the other 7 strategies. And you can see the summary here for the high capacity transit investments. Just as a sidebar, I want to just emphasize that these are estimates based on potential spending that would come with investments on the scale it would take to actually develop a high capacity transit system. But first, those multipliers for the different activities related to building a high capacity system are roughly 1.5 to 1.6. The societal benefits would exceed the investment costs over the 20-year period of the plan. The economic growth impacts would be more than $2 billion. And then the land value impacts would be about a 1 to 6% increase in property values. And when you factor in the massive value of land within half a mile of the various high capacity transit routes, such an investment would generate a very significant increase in land values. And just a reminder that the onboard plan also has a similar analysis for those other 7 strategies. Next, I'll cover the results from the final onboard survey. As onboard was being finalized, we wanted to find out and hopefully to make sure whether the project team, the consultants, the TAG, had effectively captured what the public thinks the region needs for mobility and transit. So the online survey was conducted from January to March. People could view each of the 8 strategies, read a brief description of them, and read about the implementing projects. And then they were asked to rate each of the strategies on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. We received about 10,500 unique responses. So this slide shows the overall ratings. All 8 of the recommended strategies received between 4.3 and 4.5 on the 5-point scale. We interpret that as a strong indicator that the strategies do reflect what we heard throughout all the public engagement and technical work and collaboration with stakeholders. So this slide shows the number of responses for each rating that the 8 strategies received. The overwhelming majority of them were 5 stars. Because 1 star is the lowest possible rating, we interpret that as no support or even perhaps opposition. But that was very low, averaging around about 3%. One of the demographic questions we asked was the zip code where respondents live. This map shows that, and it demonstrates that responses were spread across the valley. Obviously, there are concentrations and variations. Other demographics that we asked about were income, race, age, and gender. I won't linger too long on the next few slides, but they show the results from some of the different demographic groupings. So first is income. You can see in this table how the survey sample matches very closely with Clark County as a whole. And then the chart shows how lower income respondents overall rated the onboard strategies a little bit higher than the overall set of responses. This slide shows how higher income respondents rated the mobility strategies, generally a little lower than the overall survey respondents. And next, we briefly show the race and ethnicity demographics and responses. On average, racial and ethnic minority respondents rated the onboard recommendations a bit higher than the overall survey group. And then finally, this slide shows a summary of the responses from a larger set of different demographic breakouts. And I'll leave it here for a couple of seconds. Okay. So next, I'm going to very briefly review a prioritization exercise that we conducted with the technical advisory group back in late February. So as the onboard recommendations were out for public comment through that final survey, we wanted to start preparing for the next step of figuring out what the top priorities should be for the eventual implementation of onboard by the RTC and our local government partners. So we conducted a reveal preference exercise with the TAG where they were given a budget and asked to allocate it to the projects they most supported. Although this was not technically part of the onboard plan and it is not included in the final plan, it was an important first step for us to make sure that onboard does not sit on a shelf after it's approved. Our goal is to implement the plan, whether that is small things in the plan being implemented with the very limited resources that we have available now, or whether it's the large and sweeping vision of onboard that can be implemented in the future as we recover from the recession and additional resources may start to become available. The last topic I'll cover are the final steps and timeline as we carry onboard through to approval by the RTC board. So since the consultant contract ended at the end of June, we have met with each of the local governments in the Valley to review the plan and the recommendations. We also held a series of virtual drop-in briefings with the technical advisory group participants. Today's presentation to this committee and the staff recommendation to approve the onboard strategies and recommendations is the next step in towards final approval of the plan by the RTC board. So after your action today, which again, hopefully results in a recommendation for approval, we will take these to the RTC board, although the timing for that is still somewhat up in the air. The next steps will probably consist of developing some type of a cost estimate and hypothetical funding mechanism, kind of resembling a CIP or a TIP for the onboard plan specifically. And then that will probably go to the RTC board along with the plan, these 8 strategies and 64 projects in October or November for final board approval. Onboard will also become an appendix to the regional transportation plan, and all of the projects, or at least most of the projects, will be included as unfunded projects in the next RTP, which will be adopted in December or January. And then after that, we'll move on working with the local governments towards implementation. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from the committee? So this is Sandra Rosenberg, current chair. I'm just going to make a few comments while you guys are thinking about any other comments or questions. Thank you very much, Craig. This was certainly a lengthy and robust and very involved process to get to this point. I appreciate that the RTC is continuing on this effort despite the current economic situation, as well as probably lower ridership during the pandemic. But it's really important for things like this that you keep your eye on the ball, further down the road in terms of timelines, because it does take a long time to change kind of that landscape of transit in the region. And transit's really going to be critical, I think, for the long-term environmental and economic sustainability of this region. So even though timelines might change and funding availability might change, this document and this process really sets a strong foundation for providing needed transportation services for the region. So I really want to give this a kind of a strong endorsement and thank you for the hard work over the past several years on this. So with that, I'd be happy to open it up to any other questions or comments from the committee.
Madam Chair, this is Robert Summerfield with City of Las Vegas. I would just echo that and congratulate Craig and his team on the work that they've done on the outreach on this. I think it's been one of the more inclusive processes, and the amount of legwork that he and his team have done going between all the jurisdictions to ensure that the plan is reflective of the individual needs of the jurisdictions while being true to the region, I think has been very helpful in this process. So I would just add that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Summerfield. Any other comments or questions? Okay, if there are no more, do we have a motion to approve the or to recommend to approve, I guess?
I would make the motion to recommend approval of the onboard plan.
Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Oh, sorry. I think we got all the ayes. Any opposed? Say nay. This motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, and thank you, members of the committee. The next item will be presented by Mr. Andrew Kelman.
Thank you, Craig. Andrew Kelman, Manager of Transportation Planning for the record. Item 33 is to approve Regional Transportation Plan Amendment Clark 20-32 to the 2017-2040 Regional Transportation Plan. The current RTP was adopted in 2017, and federal regulations require it to be amended when there are major adjustments, or in this case, a new project is added to the RTP that utilizes federal funding. Next slide, please. Thank you. This RTP amendment adds one new project. The project is sponsored by the RTC, and it is for the RTC Mobile Learning Lab project in the amount of $197,000. This project was selected for discretionary funding through the Competitive Mobility for All grant program from the Federal Transit Administration. This project will build a mobile learning lab to train and educate transportation disadvantaged individuals on technology and resources to improve mobility and access to services throughout Southern Nevada. Next slide. For the approval process, there is EAC consideration today and RTC board consideration for approval at their August meeting. Adding this project does not impact air quality and is consistent with the goals and priorities of the RTP. Staff recommends approval.
Thank you, Mr. Kelman. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? This sounds like a very worthy project, and I certainly support it. So with that, do I have a motion to approve the amendments?
Ed McGuire, I motion to approve.
We have a motion. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Okay, the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Once again, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item 34 is to receive a presentation regarding the proposed fall 2020 transit service changes. Mr. Francis Julian, Deputy CEO of the RTC, the presentation.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning, Madam Chair. Francis Julian, Deputy CEO for the record. Next slide, please. As we've all experienced during the COVID-19 period, the financial strain of our agencies have been put to the test, to say the least, and that's changed our lives as we know it. The RTC is in a similar position, and we've taken several fiscal measures to correct the imbalance. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that prior to the pandemic, the RTC was already facing a $6 million fiscal deficit. So, and the outlook for this fiscal year was to have a $20 million deficit. With the pandemic, the fiscal year ended at a loss of $24 million for the agency, and the outlook was looking at $102 million. But we actually did take action. If you can click on the slide, please. Internally, we've proceeded to some cuts to actually save $40 million. The situation is still really dire, where we're facing a $63 million deficit, clearly outlining the need for new funding source. Next slide, please. Just wanted to go on how did we achieve the $40 million savings. So we eliminated and postponed some capital projects. We suspended and cut some contracts. We're currently in a hiring freeze. Management pay at the RTC was cut by up to 5%. We just concluded negotiating our collective bargaining agreement, and our employees are seeing a salary reduction. We laid off or furloughed nearly 15% of our workforce. And as I'm presenting today, we will have to proceed to some transit reductions in the valley. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, the funding sources for the RTC on the transit side are twofold. It's from sales tax revenue and fare box revenue. Unlike other transit agencies where transit is funded as well by obviously fare box revenue, sales tax, but they also have property tax, fuel tax, some have TNC taxes. The outlook for the 5 years, as I was mentioning, so the first 2 years, 24 million, 63 million, but this clearly shows the fiscal imbalance that we have at the RTC. Once again, mentioning the importance for us to find a long-term fix. But I do want to make a point where we actually did receive CARES Act money, exactly $112 million. If you could click on the slide. So we already used 24 million to balance our budget for last fiscal year. Click, please. We will use $63 million for this fiscal year, and finally the last 24 million in 2022. So this buys us, if you can click, please. This buys us a bit of time to go back to the legislature and change the funding structure of the RTC. Next slide, please. So the changes we're proposing are in 3 buckets. The first one is complete route eliminations. The second one is adjustments to certain routes. And the last one is transit frequency. Just to note that we are not changing the service area of our service. So we were really careful in those cuts to make sure that the least impact, that we had the least impact possible on the community. Where if we were cutting routes, there were alternative transit solutions for our residents. Next slide, please. So we started on June 29th, 60-day public comment period, where we're basically asking the community, the input from the community. Next slide, please. The objectives of the outreach are, whoops, we missed a slide, but okay, next slide. I guess we're missing a slide, but it's okay. I'll just speak to it. So the objectives of the outreach is to educate, listen, and learn. So educating is basically making sure that our riders and the rest of the citizens are aware of exactly what this plan entails to, listening to the community, and finally learn and try to maybe modify the plan to better suit the needs of the community. Next. So how are we doing this? With internal communication, so within the RTC, with our contractors and all of their employees. We've done massive briefing with elected officials as an outreach. We started community engagements where we did YouTube Live, in-person meetings with citizens. We're doing public relations and marketing both in paper and virtual marketing. Next slide, please. So obviously on the affected routes, we've made major efforts to target the marketing. So there's geo-targeting advertisements, as well as old school mailers and postcards depicting all the changes affecting the citizens in and around those routes. Next slide, please. What are the specific route details where cuts will happen? If we can have the next slide. So the first one is actually an initiative that we would have taken anyways with the new Harmon Bridge. Valley View will now be able to connect Valley View to the rest of the transit line. So in the past, it was a deviation to Arville, which is not natural in transit. So this route will actually just keep on going on Valley View and Arville. But still, we're still doing a lot of outreach to those citizens that were used to taking transit on Arville. They will have half a mile to actually access transit, and we're actually reaching out to businesses in that area as well. Next slide, please. Route 22, Maryland Parkway and Horizon Ridge in the Henderson area. This is a route that was introduced 4 years ago. It's still not meeting the productivity, the boarding per revenue hours standards of the RTC. So we're proposing to cut back that route from a service that is currently at 30 minutes to a 50-minute service. And we think in hourly productivity specs, this route will actually meet the RTC's criteria. Next slide, please. Route 207, so the Alta Stewart route, we're proposing discontinuing that route. One of the reasoning is most of our transit system is based on 1 mile separation in between major transit routes. Route 207 is a legacy route, which is half a mile from Charleston and Bonanza. 99% of businesses and residents that are living within half a mile of that route have access to transit routes that are half a mile away as well. It's worth noting that with this route, we'll implement a service called Silver Star, which basically will run 3 to 4 days a week from probably a 6-hour period a day to make sure that we're giving service to apartment complex, senior complexes, pharmacies, grocery stores, and doctor's office. Next slide, please. Route 209, the Vegas-Owen route, is exactly the same case as the 207, so it's within half a mile of Lake Mead and Washington. And for the same reason, we're proposing to discontinue this route. We will actually have a Silver Star service as well on that route that would run 3 to 4 days a week. Next slide, please. The Sahara Express, on the east side, the Sahara Express had 2 branches, the A and the B. The A branch, as you can see on the graphic, was going down Nellis and Lake Mead. We have 2 other transit lines that are there, so we're proposing to eliminate that branch and really just have that express route stay on the Sahara alignment. Next slide, please. The WAX and the CX, so we're proposing to discontinue the Westcliff Airport Express and change the Centennial Express. Basically, this is actually good news. We're combining those 2 routes. Those 2 routes were low productivity routes for the RTC, and we're actually taking the highest ridership bus stops of each route and combining them in one more efficient route. This will truly be an express where people that take the bus at Centennial Express will go directly to the BTC. From the BTC, the next stop going down I-15 will be UNLV, And finally, the last two stops would be at Terminal 1 and 2. Next slide, please. The Henderson Downtown Express, this is the Boulder City route. We're proposing to cut the Boulder City, or actually to terminate the Boulder City route in Water Street in Henderson. It used to go all the way down to the BTC. Some good news for the users of this route: the frequency will actually increase in that new smaller route. Unfortunately for citizens that needs to go to the BTC, they will have to connect with the Boulder Highway Express, and their transit journey will be extended by about 20 minutes. Next route, please. Next slide, please. The Strip and Downtown Express, or the SDX, we're proposing a full elimination. This route, with the modification we'll make to the Deuce, will share 97% of the bus stops with the Deuce. The sections that will not be serviced by the Deuce is the Convention Center, which we believe the new boring company tunnel will be able to bridge that area. And it's worth noting that during big conventions, we always provide circulators for attendees of conventions. The other portion of that route that will not be serviced by the Deuce is the downtown area and servicing the Las Vegas Premium Outlet malls. We will still have a shuttle that will be on the same path as the SDX was to connect to the Deuce and provide service. Next slide, please. For paratransit, as I was mentioning, we tried not to contract our service area. Unfortunately, we have 0.3 miles of our service area that will be contracted. There's 12 customers, paratransit customers, that were affected. All those customers are grandfathered. It's really worth noting that only one ride was taken by those 12 customers in last year, but we still reached out individually to those customers. Next slide, please. So obviously we're in the exactly in the middle of the outreach. We started some public meetings this week on YouTube Live. Yesterday we had another outreach, and next week we'll be having in-person outreach sessions at the Bonneville Transit Center. Next slide, please. So the timeline, we're, as I was mentioning, in the middle of the outreach that ends on August 28th. We will be seeking board approval on September 10th, and the service change could be in effect as early as October 4th. This concludes my report, and I'm available to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? I would just like to say that this is certainly not any news that we enjoy hearing, but I, again, want to applaud the RTC for their thorough and transparent outreach on these issues. It looks like, you know, the outreach is certainly extensive, and to have a longer comment period and engage in those communities that might be affected. So again, I want to applaud that, and being proactive in terms of with the CARES Act money, that helps for a little bit, but making the changes now likely reduce the need to make more extreme cuts at a later date. So again, I want to thank you for that. I'm going to open up one more time. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Okay, this item was informational, so we will move on to the next item. Mr. Penuelas.
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman Rosenberg. John Penuelas again for the record. The last item on your agenda is the last and final citizens participation opportunity.
This is the second time set aside for public comment. Just a reminder that comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Eileen Pastor for the record. We do have one public comment from Alita Dupree. Greetings, Chair Travis Anderson and members. Alita Dupree for the record. Concerning general EAC matters, I am generally in support of the onboard mobility program. It should be sent to the board for approval at the August meeting. I do support the new proposed changes to fixed route service on the Sahara Express and Deuce and SDX. I also support Clark 20-32 amendment for the mobility lab. It's time to move away from paper bus tickets. We should add single rides to the RTC app, as well as ticketing for Paratransit, and a stored value card for those who don't have app-capable phones. I use the Ride RTC app myself. It works well. Continue to support the Veterans Medical Transportation Network. Thank you. Chairwoman Rosenberg, that concludes your public comment.
Thank you so much. And Alita Dupree, if you were listening, thank you very much for your comment. Are there any other, let's see, oh, no more comments. I will close this item. Any other general comments from the committee? Okay, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.